Um, I guess I could start here. When I was kind of looking through your bio on the Smithsonian website, it said that when you started, there were no staff members, no collection, no funding, anything. When you look back at where you were in 2005 to where this project is now in 2021, what stands out to you?
What stands out to me is the amazing array of people, some Smithsonian people, some donors, some average folks who believed in this when maybe they shouldn't have believed. And they gave us that support. So for me, it's really an example of how when you cross political lines and racial lines with a good idea, that you can get something done. And as I look back, I am so proud that museum is there. I am humbled that at a time of discourse around issues of race, around issues of fairness, the museum is both a symbol and a source that can give people the sort of information, the reality, and a little bit of hope.
That's definitely, having been there, I guess hope is the big word that I came away with. Like I went there for my first time. I believe I was a junior in college,
Mhm.
and I went there with my friend at the time. And one experience that always stands out to me is she was a freshman, I was a junior at the time, and there were certain things I had experienced or I'd learned about, specifically with Emmett Till,
Mhm.
and seeing the picture of him after he was killed. She had never seen that picture. So when we got down to the bottom floor and we went to that part of the museum, she saw the picture and she immediately started breaking down crying. And I've seen people cry from movies, I've seen people cry from a lot of different things, but I've never seen someone move so strongly about an exhibit in a museum. I guess my question from that is like, what do you think about, what do you think it is about this museum, specifically the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that moves people, whether it be an emotional way or it can just or bring them great joy? What do you think it is about this museum that stands out?
I think in some ways, first of all, it's the richness of the culture. That the culture itself gives you moments to cry, moments to smile, and moments to draw strength from. So I think it was really capturing the culture. But but I really spent a lot of time thinking about how do you make this a place that's not just a museum, but that is a place that is an institution that moves you, that inspires you. And I thought a lot about, black culture is about emotion, whether it's how you tap your toes to Duke Ellington or whether it's sort of, feeling the pain of our experience. So I didn't ever want anybody to be able to just walk through the museum and not be touched. I always was driven by John Hope Franklin, the great historian who chaired my scholarly advisory board until his death. And he used to always say to me, Lonnie, I hope you can make sure that as we build this museum, that when people go through, they'll be changed. And so that was my sort of North Star, saying I wanted people to be changed by either the knowledge, the emotion, or the strength of a people. And I think that the staff succeeded in doing that. I don't think that anybody who goes to that museum um, can't have their heart touched and their brain stimulated and their ethics challenged.
And just going off of that question and just talking about how the museum makes people feel so many different emotions and it touches them. I watched the address that you gave when the museum first had its dedication ceremony, and you talked about an experience where you had gone to at the museum early in the morning to see like the sunrise, and you came across a man that was so overcome with emotion that he started crying because he was so happy to see this museum being built. And it automatically made me think of my grandmother, who grew up in Savannah, Georgia, born in 1927, moved all the way up to Brooklyn where she had my mother, and she became the first person in my family that graduated college. My brother doing all these amazing things. And I always think about, she got to see so many different things in her life. She got to see Barack Obama be elected, just a lot of different things, but I wish she could have seen this museum. Is there anybody for you that that helped you along your journey or helped in the creation of this museum that didn't necessarily get to see its doors open that you would have loved to bring to the museum?
Well, I mean, like you, my dad died before we opened the museum. And it was really very hard for me because he so inspired me and challenged me to sort of fight the good fight. And I wanted him to see it. It was wonderful that my mother was able to see it, and so that was very, very powerful. But I wish my dad could have seen it, partly because I built the museum for him and for your grandmother. I mean, in some ways, this was really a way to honor what they went through, and for them to sort of see themselves in a positive light. And so I think that was really, for me, one of the sad moments. Um, but as I said, I'm Lonnie the third, and when I went up to speak and suddenly saw, I thought hear him calling Lonnie Bunch, I kept thinking of my father and my grandfather. So it gave me great comfort that somehow they were celebrating them.
I think when I think about the museum, I think about, I guess, going off that idea of just certain people not being able to be here to see the museum. And recently, like I read about one of the new exhibits that's coming up that's going to chronicle some of the protest movements that have happened within the last year. And there's going to be a prominent, I guess, portrait of Breonna Taylor that is currently featured in the museum. I guess one thing I would ask you, not just for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but all of the Smithsonian's, how do you capture this past year, 18 months? How do you put that into perspective in a museum?
Well, I think a couple things. Um, we created a kind of rapid response group whose job it was to go out and collect January 6th, or a Black Lives Matter march in DC, or a George Floyd protest in Minnesota, because I felt that often in my career there were times I wanted to tell certain stories and museums didn't have the artifacts. Nobody thought that was important enough to collect. So I wanted people to realize, who worked for me, that part of our job was to collect today for tomorrow. Some of it we might not use, but other curators or scholars down the road, 20 years or 50 years, will be able to use that. I also felt that this was such an important moment, the dual pandemics, really, the virus, racism, that I felt that it was not only important for us to document it, but for us to get the stuff out, to allow people to sort of to contextualize the moment, to use history so people will have sort of tools or weapons to live their lives, to understand the challenges they face, to really help a country confront its tortured racial past.
I guess my last two questions, because I know you got a busy day. So I
It's
got
okay. You got,
um
I give Jersey folks get a break, so
the first of those two questions I would ask is, having gone to school in DC, having lived there for some time now, what do you think it is about, specifically about DC, that makes the African American history and culture fit in what is known as Chocolate City? What do you think is specifically about the city?
I mean, I think that's it. I think that in many ways, DC has had a unique relationship with Black America, Black Washingtonians. On the one hand, you have the kind of educational impact of Howard University, of sort of some of the best minds coming through Washington, engaging students. I think you also have the sense that DC, even though it wasn't, as celebrated as, say, Harlem, in some ways it was as rich culturally, whether it's the music, the poetry, the theater. So what you have in DC is really a opportunity to dig deeply into African American life and culture. Also, DC also gave a larger opportunity for a Black middle class to work for the federal government, right? So it became a steadier gig. I think the challenge is that one should never overstate how fair DC was, because DC was so regularly regionally segregated. You still couldn't go many places. Even when I was a freshman at Howard in 1970, they told us that if you were going sort of north of DuPont Circle, heading to Georgetown, that if there were gangs of white kids that came after you, you could run to the Turkish embassy, and that when they would give you cover.
Wow.
So I remember thinking about that, going, "What are you kidding me?" Um, and so I think that in some ways, the challenge of DC is it's no longer Chocolate City, right? That you see a large number of non-African Americans moving in. The black population declined. Um, I live in Shepherd Park, which is an area that was integrated, and I've been here now 15 years. And what's interesting is I would say two out of every new couple, two out of three every new couple is non-African American. So you see a neighborhood changing dramatically like the rest of Washington, D.C. So I think the challenge for Washington is to sort of celebrate that culture and to make sure that even if it's no longer Chocolate City, once you move into Washington, you're shaped by this culture.
I guess my last question would be, when you look to the future, thinking about going back to the address that you gave when during the dedication ceremony, you mentioned your granddaughter. And when you look at her future, like what do you want her generation to take away from this museum when it's 5, 10 years, 15 years down the line?
I want the museum to be seen by people like my granddaughter as a clarion call to continue to challenge America to live up to its ideals, to create a new generation of activists who recognize that they have a profound responsibility and an opportunity to sort of demand fairness, and to recognize that you are really standing on so many amazing shoulders. Names you've heard, Frederick Douglass, Fannie Lou Hamer, but thousands of names you've never heard of, who opened doors, who died, who struggled. And so, what I want is people who come to the museum, like my granddaughter, never to settle, but to always recognize they've got a chance to help a country be fairer and freer. And what an important goal that would be.
Definitely. Well, again, thank you so much for giving your time. I really do appreciate it.